Eventually, that pressure becomes great enough to fracture the seal, and the sudden release generates earthquakes and surface deformation. The researchers found this same cyclical process was responsible for both the 1980s Bradyseismic crisis and the unrest of the past 15 years, essentially identifying the same underlying mechanism reactivating rather than two entirely separate volcanic phenomena. Perhaps most notably, the study suggested a possible way to reduce the danger. The researchers proposed that managing surface water runoff, or actively reducing groundwater levels feeding into the geothermal reservoir, potentially even by extracting fluids from wells, could lower the fluid pressure driving the cycle and reduce the frequency or intensity of the resulting seismicity. It's an idea that, if proven practical and safe at scale, could represent one of the first realistic intervention strategies for managing risk at an active caldera, though such an approach would require extremely careful study before ever being implemented near a city of millions. Visual evidence collected in the field over recent years adds a striking, almost tangible dimension to this research. At a location where a modest natural spring pool existed back in 2016, researchers documented a dramatic transformation by 2024, watching it grow into a broad, water-filled basin so much larger that the wooden fence posts that once marked its boundary were, by 2024, completely submerged. That kind of steady, visible increase in water discharge from the geothermal system offers direct, on-the-ground confirmation of what the instruments have been recording remotely, that the hydrothermal system beneath Campi Flegrei has been intensifying, not stabilizing. The seismicity itself has continued to show clear patterns of acceleration in specific windows. During one particularly active stretch in February and March of 2026, INRGV's Vesuvian Observatory recorded approximately 70 earthquakes in a single week between February 23rd and March 1st, with magnitudes reaching up to 3, 5, concentrated beneath the towns of Pozzuoli and Agnano. In the more routine week of July 13th through 19th, 2026, activity was comparatively calmer but still persistent, with 8 recorded earthquakes of magnitude 0 or greater, the largest reaching roughly magnitude 0. 8. Ground deformation. During that same week continued at the steady rate of about 10 millimeters per month, and geochemical monitoring confirmed the long-term trend scientists have been tracking for years: continued heating of the hydrothermal system and increased emission of magmatic fluids. Based on that data, monitoring authorities assessed that no significant short-term changes were anticipated at that particular moment, a routine and reassuring update, though one that came only weeks before the magnitude 4. 7 earthquake at the end of July demonstrated just how quickly the situation can still produce a significant event, even amid otherwise unremarkable weekly reports. So where is all of this heading? This is the question everyone living in and around Naples, and frankly anyone watching this unfold from outside Italy, inevitably wants answered. The honest scientific answer is that nobody can say with certainty, and any credible volcanologist studying Campi Flegrei will tell you exactly that. What researchers can say is that a 2026 modeling study examining the long-term trajectory of ground deformation and seismic energy release projected that the system could reach what scientists describe as a critical mechanical threshold sometime between 2030 and 2034. It's essential to understand precisely what that phrase means because it is frequently misunderstood or sensationalized. A critical mechanical threshold does not necessarily mean an eruption. The researchers behind that projection were explicit on this point. It could instead represent what they call a regime change, a shift in how the system behaves mechanically. That might take the form of new fractures opening in the crust, a noticeable increase in fumarole activity, meaning stronger and more widespread venting of volcanic gases at the surface, or even localized ground failure in specific areas, none of which constitutes a volcanic eruption in the traditional sense. It's the geological equivalent of a bridge under increasing structural stress. At some point, something has to give, but what exactly gives and how significant that event turns out to be remains genuinely uncertain, dependent on variables that are difficult to fully model even with today's monitoring technology. This uncertainty is precisely why Italian authorities have taken the threat seriously enough to significantly update their emergency planning. More than 500,000 people live within the government's officially designated red zone, an area encompassing 15 municipalities considered to be at the highest risk in the event that unrest rapidly escalates toward eruption. In response to the accelerating activity of recent years, Italian authorities revised and updated their mass evacuation contingency plans between 2023 and 2024. An enormous logistical undertaking given the sheer population density of the area and its proximity to Naples, one of Italy's largest and most historic cities. Planning an evacuation for 500,000 people across a region with limited road infrastructure squeezed between the sea, hills, and dense urban development is an extraordinarily complex challenge, and it's one Italian civil protection authorities have had to take increasingly seriously as the scientific data has continued to trend in one direction. It's worth stepping back to appreciate just how remarkable the monitoring infrastructure around this caldera actually is. INGV operates one of the densest geophysical monitoring networks anywhere in the world at Campi Flegrei, a direct consequence of the enormous population living atop and around it. This network includes 25 ground deformation benchmarks alone, feeding continuous data that allows scientists to detect uplift changes at millimeter scale precision, alongside seismic networks capable of detecting and locating even extremely small earthquakes that most residents would never feel. This comprehensive coverage is precisely what has allowed researchers to build the detailed, high-resolution picture of unrest evolution described throughout this story, distinguishing between hydrothermal processes and genuinely magmatic ones, tracking the depth and location of tens of thousands of individual earthquakes, and identifying subtle patterns like the millimeter-scale coseismic subsidence detected after the 2024 quake that would have been completely invisible with less sophisticated instrumentation. Despite everything described here, it's important to maintain perspective and resist the pull toward alarmism that so often surrounds supervolcano stories online. Campi Flegrei is genuinely one of the most closely watched volcanic systems on Earth, and that intensive scrutiny is precisely why scientists are able to speak with reasonable confidence when they say there are currently no signs pointing toward an imminent eruption, even after a magnitude 4.7 earthquake, even after tens of thousands of recorded seismic events, and even after more than 1.33 meters of cumulative ground uplift. Naples and the surrounding Campi Flegrei region remain, according to current assessments, a place people can safely visit and live in day to day, with the volcanic activity being continuously and carefully tracked rather than emerging as any kind of sudden surprise. The distinction between long-term monitored unrest and short-term eruptive danger is one that gets lost in headlines but matters enormously in reality. A caldera can remain in a state of unrest, technically restless and seismically active, for decades or even centuries without erupting. And history at this exact location supports that. The ground rose for a prolonged period before the 1538 eruption of Monte Nuovo, but it has also risen substantially during the 1980s crisis and settled without an eruption at all. What makes the current episode scientifically significant isn't that an eruption is imminent, because the evidence doesn't currently support that conclusion. What makes it significant is that researchers are, for the first time, gathering the kind of high-resolution, multidisciplinary data spanning seismology, ground deformation, gas geochemistry, and even laboratory rock mechanics that allows them to actually understand the underlying physical processes driving a caldera's restlessness in real time, rather than reconstructing them years after the fact from historical records. The 2024 earthquake analysis showing fluid-driven subsidence, the identification of the caprock failure cycle by the Stanford team, the tracking of magma-driven unrest patterns from 2007 through 2023, and the fine-scale earthquake relocation work using machine learning are all pieces of a much larger scientific puzzle. Together, they're steadily transforming Campi Flegrei from a source of mystery and fear into one of the best understood restless calderas on the planet, even as its earthquakes continue and its ground continues, month after month, to rise. If you found this deep dive into the science behind Campi Flegrei's unrest valuable, consider subscribing so you don't miss future breakdowns of the geological events shaping our planet, and drop a comment below sharing what part of this story surprised you most. If you want to help this channel keep producing carefully researched, fact-checked content like this, give this video a like and share it with someone who'd find it just as fascinating as you did. Magma is stirring beneath one of the most densely populated places on Earth, and the ground is rising fast enough that you could watch it happen over the course of a single year. 500,000 people go about their daily lives directly on top of a volcano so large that its entire crater isn't a single peak you can point to, but a sunken landscape wide enough to hold a city. That city is called Pozzuoli, and it sits inside a caldera the Romans once called the Phlegrean Fields, the burning fields. For nearly 2 decades, the earth beneath it has been swelling, cracking, and shaking, and in the past 2 years, that shaking has grown stronger than anything recorded there in over 4 decades. Scientists are no longer simply watching a curiosity of geology. They are trying to understand what happens when hot pressurized fluid, some of it born directly from magma deep below, forces its way upward through rock that is slowly running out of room to bend. To understand why this matters, you have to understand what Campi Flegrei actually is. It is not a mountain. It is a caldera, a vast depression formed when a volcano's magma chamber emptied so violently in a past eruption that the ground above it collapsed inward. The main structure was carved out roughly 39,000 years ago in an eruption known as the Campanian ignimbrite, one of the largest volcanic events in Europe in the last 200,000 years, an explosion so massive it likely altered climate patterns across the region and blanketed much of the Mediterranean in ash. A second, smaller collapse followed about 15,000 years ago, called the Neapolitan Yellow Tuff eruption, which reshaped the caldera into roughly the form it holds today. Since then, the area has continued to erupt periodically, producing more than 70 individual eruptions and leaving behind a caldera studded with over 20 craters, cones, and volcanic domes. This is not one volcano in the traditional sense. It is a sprawling volcanic system, a patchwork of vents and structures sitting above a shared reservoir of heat and magma that has never fully gone quiet. The most recent eruption happened in 1538, when a new hill, Monte Nuovo, rose from the ground near Pozzuoli in the span of about a week, an event witnessed and documented by people living in the area at the time. Before that eruption, the ground had been slowly rising for centuries, a warning sign that, in hindsight, foreshadowed what was coming. After 1538, the region entered a long period of relative quiet. But relative quiet at a caldera like this one does not mean the underlying system is dead. It means the pressure is redistributing, the hydrothermal system is adjusting, and the magma below is doing what magma does across geological time, cooling in some places, intruding in others, and constantly interacting with groundwater, gases, and the rock around it. The current phase of unrest began in 2005, when instruments started detecting slow but steady ground uplift, along with shifts in the chemistry of gases escaping from the ground. This was not the first time in modern history the caldera has stirred. Between 1982 and 1984, Pozzuoli experienced a dramatic episode of ground deformation known as Bradyseism, during which the town's harbor floor rose so much that boats could no longer dock properly, and tens of thousands of residents were evacuated as a precaution. That crisis eventually subsided. The ground settled somewhat, and life returned to something like normal. But the reprieve didn't last. Starting in the mid-2000s, uplift resumed, and unlike the episodic bursts of the 1980s, this new phase has continued, with the rate of ground rise generally increasing over time rather than fading away. By November 2024, cumulative uplift at Pozzuoli had reached approximately 33 meters since the current unrest began, and by some more recent estimates, the total has pushed past 4 meters. To put that in perspective, this is ground that has risen well over 4 feet in less than 2 decades, in a densely built urban area, without a single eruption occurring. Monitoring stations, operated by Italy's National Institute of Geophysics and Volcanology, known as INGV, track this deformation continuously using a dense network of GPS benchmarks, tilt meters, and satellite radar interferometry, giving scientists an extraordinarily detailed picture of how the ground is behaving, sometimes down to millimeter scale changes month by month. Pore pressure is essentially the pressure exerted by fluid trapped within the tiny spaces and fractures inside rock formations. When that pressure builds high enough, it can reduce the effective strength of the rock, making it far easier for existing faults to slip and rupture, even without any large-scale movement of molten magma itself. Instead, it's releasing heat and gas that percolate upward, heating groundwater, altering the chemistry of the shallow crust, and generating enormous pressure that the overlying rock must somehow accommodate, either by slowly deforming, by venting gas through fumaroles, or by rupturing in earthquakes. Some of the most compelling recent research has come from a team at Stanford, published in Science Advances in 2025, which used subsurface imaging combined with laboratory experiments on rock samples to model exactly how this pressure builds and releases. Their findings identified a specific mechanism involving a layer of rock acting as a caprock, or seal, sitting above the geothermal reservoir beneath Pozzuoli. When this caprock is intact and effectively sealed, pressure from water and steam trapped in the reservoir below builds up over time.